Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960, where our country is going, and where, from an economic standpoint, particularly, is I think of interest to a lot of people because we've gone through the pandemic, we've gone through low interest rates, we've gone through high interest rates. We're worried about deficit, we're worried about productivity and prosperity. And I read a really interesting column by a young, bright guy. Kevin Yin is his name. He's an economist. He's a columnist at the Globe and Mail. He's a fellow at the University of California at Berkeley. And he wrote this really interesting article about how Canada and our monetary fiscal strategies may not be able to be different or much different than what's happening in the United States. So, Kevin, welcome to the show, sir.
Hi, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So you write with the Globe and Mail about economics. Tell me, where do you think our economy is headed, and particularly, can we diverge in our monetary strategy, our interest rate strategy from the United States?
Yeah, I would say that there's a limit to how much we can diverge, but that limit, we're not really close to that limit right now, and I think that's the key point. People are a little bit concerned about if we lower rates too fast, how that's going to affect our currency values, and the op-ed I wrote is kind of saying, well, we shouldn't worry about that right now. We have a bit of breathing room. It's going to affect the loonie, but that's a secondary consideration compared to unemployment and just how weak the economy looks in general, right?
So I was at a keynote speech by chief economist at CIBC. I think his name is Benjamin Tal, and he was saying that we can have 75 basis point difference than U.S. in interest rates, but if anything more than that, we'll end up not solving our problem. In fact, creating a bigger problem because we'll import inflation from the United States. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's roughly correct. The numbers differ from bank to bank. They're using different models for their analysis. I've heard numbers more on the order of 100 basis points, but yeah, I think that logic is broadly correct.
Why? Explain that to everyone if you could.
Yeah, so people are, at the end of the day, what they're concerned about is how this is going to affect import prices, right? And that it might spike up inflation again through the imports. But there's some research from RBC that says, well, this mechanism is actually kind of limited. It's mitigated by the fact that 80%, this is a number from them, 80% of our consumer goods are actually produced domestically. And the domestic prices that you see on the grocery store shelves depend so much on things like transportation, services that bring it from A to B, and put it in front of you there, that the import prices themselves, the pass-through is actually quite limited. So, for now, with not too much spread between our interest rate and the Fed's, I think the argument there is that, it just won't show up that much in inflation.
So do you think there's going to be a July reduction? You a month ago wrote that there should have been a there should be a June reduction, and you were right. There was a June reduction. What do you think about what's coming up in the next 2 weeks?
I think they're looking at a July reduction for sure. I'm less certain about this one. I think they probably want to give it some space and look at the core inflation indicators and, make sure everything's good, maybe for another month or so before they go down. But I certainly wouldn't rule it out. Inflation
ticked up a little bit in the last 2 weeks, did it not?
Yes, I believe it did.
And so I think that's probably a good reason to not have a rate reduction. Make sure that inflation is marching on its way down before one starts decreasing interest rates a little bit more.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, they're definitely, they want to be cautious about this. The costs of getting it wrong are enormous. So, they're going to be careful. But
you wrote another column about a month ago. You said inflation is cooling, people are struggling to pay their mortgages, and businesses are rapidly going insolvent. And on that, you argue that we should cut the interest rates. Do you really think businesses are rapidly going insolvent?
Yeah, the exact numbers kind of elude me right now, but it shows up in the data. There are serious skyrocketing insolvencies in the past little while with the high interest rates, and it's a huge problem.
And what's the interest in people struggling to pay mortgages?
Well, it's just it's part of the affordability crisis, right? This is on the tip of everyone's tongue right now, and there's actually a really interesting thing where when we look at the core inflation indicators, right? One of the components of the core inflation indicators is housing costs, right? But the way interest rates work on everything else, right? They should lower inflation. They should lower prices or the speed of price growth and everything else. But when it comes to living costs, rent, mortgages, it's actually not clear how interest rates affect that. And there's actually some good evidence and some good logic to suggest that it works the other way for that component of inflation, right? Because, I mean, obviously, when interest rates are higher, mortgages are more expensive. There's some evidence to say that that passes through to rents too, right? And so you have this one part of inflation that's, very persistent right now that higher interest rates may actually make worse. And so I think that was part of the reason that I said, okay, it's time for a June rate cut, and we should be looking at people are struggling right now, and maybe focusing on that a little bit more than inflation.
So I think CPI the last couple of months, year over year, is down around 3%, 3.1, et cetera. But if you take out mortgage payments or housing payments, you're actually below 2%, I understand. And so I think you're right that it's kind of counterintuitive that that the higher interest rates actually feed inflation to a certain extent.
To a certain extent, not in the broad sense, not overall, but if you're really a stickler for just looking at that core inflation indicator and you're not thinking about, well, what those subcomponents are, I think you're going to miss this important fact. And the research that I'm talking about there it comes from the New York Federal Reserve. There are no slouches on rigor on this kind of thing. So I think it's fairly trustworthy.
You also wrote that the new capital gains taxes are another reason why the Bank of Canada should reduce its interest rate. Why would the capital gains tax be a reason to reduce interest rates?
This is a really good question. It kind of works in two ways. One is it just slows down the economy, right? We're going to see less investment, which, people are talking about this mainly from a long run perspective, right? How this affects growth. I think that's probably first order. But in terms of inflation, a capital gains tax is going to, take money out of people's pockets and reduce investment, which is, it's bad for GDP in the short run. The other reason is that it gives us a bit of breathing room from a monetary policy standpoint, which is because it restricts demand, it takes money out of people's pockets. So the demand pressures that create inflation are reduced. So that capital gains tax actually gives us a bit of space to say, okay, demand is not so high. I think we have a little bit more space to cut rates.
You've got a really interesting background. You've got a BA in economics, philosophy, and mathematics from the University of Toronto. You've got an MA in economics from Yale University, and now you're doing a PhD in economics at Berkeley in California. Tell me a little bit about your motivation to become such a smart guy in economics.
Um, well, I think it comes down to I'm just really interested in people's livelihoods and sort of preserving those, protecting those, growing those. I think that comes from when I was growing up, I grew up in the financial crisis. It affected me personally, my family personally. My dad lost his job in that time. Um, and I kind of saw firsthand like how these kinds of really abstract ideas, you see these derivatives and interest rates and all these things that, a lot of people, it's hard to make sense of maybe for laymen, how these kind of abstract things can impact people's lives. And I think, yeah, I just found that really interesting and really like a really important issue to kind of address and learn more about.
Why, at the same time you're doing a PhD, become a regular columnist at the Globe and Mail?
Well, the issue is, and you hear this a lot, but I think this is particularly pernicious in economics, sorry, is just the translation from academic rigor and research into, public knowledge and the general conversation is pretty limited, right? I mean, people aren't reading the American Economic Review because it's like a lot of dense math and it's kind of hard to read, and a lot of it, even if it was easily readable, it wouldn't seem maybe relevant at first, or how it wouldn't be clear how to parse those kinds of things. So I think it's really important to be able to translate that information so that people can make, more informed decisions about their lives.
I don't think it's
And so
just in economics. I think it's almost in every area of academia.
I think that's definitely true. I think just for, economics, since it's so policy relevant as opposed to maybe some other fields that it's particularly pernicious.
What's your thesis on?
So I'm pretty early in the PhD right now, but the topics I kind of focus on are broadly looking at issues in the macroeconomy. So um, things like how we ought to deal with financial crises. There was a big debate in 2008. Should we do fiscal stimulus or should we support the banks? Trying to figure out how to balance those two policies is something I'm looking at. Uh, the harm of sovereign default. So, a country can't pay back their debt like Argentina in the past. How does that actually hurt the economy? What's the mechanism? And how bad is that? Quantifying that problem. And something else I'm kind of looking at is some climate economics. So, how we can improve energy trade, how we can set up the electricity grid to allow faster adoption of clean energy.
Fascinating. I look forward to following your columns and your thesis development, etc. I'm struggling through doing a doctorate myself, believe it or not, a DBA,
Wow.
a doctorate in business, and I was studying how companies and communities get through tough times, economic tough times, and I was always a financially oriented executive, an M&A, capital markets oriented person, and thought that it was money and access to capital and things like that. And after doing a lot of research, I came to the conclusion it was social capital. It was relationships. It was, those bonding and bridging, linking relationships that Mark Granovator wrote famous papers about that ended up being the keys to success. So I think one of the fascinating things about delving into a topic and trying to figure what your research question is and what you're going to write about, and then doing the research about it is sometimes you'll end up in a very different place than where you started out. And so I think that your journey is going to be really interesting. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with our smart Berkeley PhD Globe columnist and talking about the Canadian economy in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're talking about the Canadian economy tonight with Kevin Yin. He is a economist. He's doing his PhD at Berkeley in California. He's also a regular columnist with the Globe and Mail, and I've read several of his columns recently. He's a great writer, and I think his attitude that he wants to take sort of economic academic thought and translate it into practical explanations for people makes a ton of sense. And so I think that's great. I got to ask you, you mentioned that you were interested in clean energy and the economic impact on clean energy. This carbon tax has been a huge issue, and you've written a couple of times on the future economy will suffer if Canada axes the carbon tax. And you almost wrote, I think, that you think the carbon tax is a good tax and a good way from an economic standpoint of influencing. You said the carbon tax is the single most effective climate policy that Canada has. But the tax is also an important industrial strategy, one that bets correctly on the growing need for greener energy globally and the fact that upstart Canadian companies must rise to meet these needs. So many people are on this bandwagon of axe the tax, but you're an economist and you're arguing it actually makes sense. Tell me why.
Yeah, well, there's the sort of Econ 101 logic, which is that there's a negative externality in the economy, right? There's pollution that hurts everybody, but the companies that are polluting, they don't internalize that cost, so they don't pollute at a level that's optimal for everybody else. And so the carbon tax fixes this problem, and I think most economists would agree with that. What I was arguing in that article is actually, taking it a step further to say, well, it's very popular to do industrial policy nowadays, right? To have government support for industries that we deem strategic. And I think, that in general is kind of a complicated issue. But in terms of clean energy, I think it's broadly an important thing. And the carbon tax, for that reason, is also an important business strategy because it basically directs investment and growth and, all the power of the markets toward the industries that we think, the industries of the future, the industries that we think are going to be robust in a more clean economy, more robust to policies with our trade partners when they're saying, okay, well, we don't want your dirty fuel anymore, or we don't want your dirty products anymore. As these trends continue, it's going to be important to incentivize our own industries to meet those demands. And so that was kind of what I was saying in that article.
I read a fascinating article at one point in time, a year or two ago, that was talking about California. And since you're at Berkeley, maybe this has some resonance. And it quoted Gretzky's comment about, skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it was. And it argued that California's sort of more progressive and at times restrictive regulations actually are helpful to California businesses because they cause them to adjust earlier, more quickly to where the world is going to be, where industrial development is going to be, and then they can take advantage of that. And the people that are looking to where the puck is currently or where it was will be slower to adapt and will therefore be behind the eight ball and will have more challenges adapting. And so the argument was that actually, and they didn't talk about carbon tax in this article, as far as I remember, it was really in regards to tighter regulations and understanding where regulation is going to be globally in the future and sort of anticipate and put that regulation in place right away. So is that an argument that supports what you're saying, is that, if you want to develop a more cleaner, greener economy, actually a carbon tax is a great way to do it. And if you get rid of it, by definition, people will adjust more slowly and we may be actually behind the times.
Well, I love that analogy because I'm from Edmonton. So, yeah, I think that's sort of the logic I'm getting at. I will add the caveat that, yeah, California is losing some business to Texas, right? And there is a limit to how much a government can see where the puck is going to be. And I think that's the cautionary aspect of that. But the thing with the carbon tax is it's just so broad, and it's really not picking and choosing, which companies or which specific industries to support, right? It's just saying, okay, I mean, carbon is bad, carbon emissions are bad. So we're just gonna tax that, right? We're not gonna tell you like what to make or how much to spend on different things. We're just gonna say, okay, to the extent that you put out carbon, we're gonna punish you for that. That's it. When people talk about industrial policy, they generally think about subsidies. But there's a sense in which like subsidies and taxes are kind of equivalent. If you set them up the right way, they're kind of equivalent from a government standpoint, right? Because they both cost you money, right? And the thing, like, if you tax people, right, it slows down the economy. That can cost you a bit of money. If you subsidize them, well, you're putting money out there. That costs you money. So either way, it's going to cost you a bit of money. With subsidies, you're going to have to choose like, oh, this company deserves a subsidy, this one doesn't. It actually, it's kind of difficult to implement policy-wise. Whereas a carbon tax, it's a lot simpler. It's a lot more elegant as a policy. And I think for that reason, I think the puck analogy works quite well.
I agree with you. However, you take a look at an announcement of a couple $2 billion or whatever it is being given to an EV manufacturer or a battery manufacturer or something like that. The press is positive, and politicians will come out of all stripes and be there for the cutting of the ribbon or the shoveling of the shovel, and brag about that subsidy that they're giving. And some of them are unbelievably large, and they've got to be paid back by way of extra taxation or deficit spending or something like that in the future. And yet, when it's more generally applied via the carbon tax, people go crazy and want to axe the tax. So tell me, why is it that we've got this? Are we more prone to like the subsidy because we don't think we pay for it, and dislike the carbon tax because we know we pay for it? What is it?
I think you hit the nail on the head. I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. People see a subsidy, they don't feel that coming out of their pocket. People see a tax, they feel that coming out of their pocket. And I'm sympathetic to it, right? Like, just I don't like it when prices for things go up for me either. And the subsidy that just doesn't get felt for maybe even in my generation, right? Who knows when the government is going to have to raise taxes to meet that obligation. But I think that's not the right way to think about it. And ultimately, someone's going to hold that bill, and it's going to end up being you either way.
So you're saying the subsidy will actually cost us at some point in time?
Yeah, because we have to pay it back, right? I mean, we're all in favor of some level of fiscal sustainability. We're going to have to pay that back. Either we cut those subsidies or we tax them at some point, or tax people at some point to pay for them.
So some people compare carbon tax to, these sin taxes, the cigarette tax and the alcohol tax and stuff like that, where we've increased the taxation on things that are deemed bad, and try to discourage people from consuming them. And I think we've got pretty extensive taxation on alcohol and on cigarettes, as an example. Do they work? Do you think, is there economic proof that sin taxes actually discourage consumption?
Yeah. So there is some good evidence that they work. Now the question is, how much do they work? And that's going to depend on the thing. So economists will say that demand for a lot of the things that you might sin tax are inelastic, right? They might not be super responsive to the price of the good. Like, if you are a smoker and you need to smoke all the time, maybe if the price goes up 20%, you're pissed off, but that doesn't change the fact that, you're still going to buy that pack of Marlboros. And I think there is an argument to be made that this applies a little bit to carbon as well. But the carbon issue is just, so front and center. It's so important. I think that, the tax is still valuable. The other thing I'll say about the carbon taxes, and I think people understand this to varying degrees, is that most people do get their money back. They get more money back than they pay in the tax. I think it's just like a visceral response to seeing the prices a little bit higher that people are reacting to.
I don't think most people understand they get the money back. Actually, I think that's one of the failures of the communication. Tell me why you think this axe the tax has become, so prevalent and so popular.
Yeah, well, like I said, varying degrees, right? Some people understand, some people don't. I think you're completely right. I think, there's been miscommunication. There's been certainly a lot of political opportunism, I think. And there's just, economics is hard, and it's not always easy to put all the pieces together and think that, oh, like this cost me just as much as that and whatnot.
You wrote a really interesting article about liquefied natural gas, and let me quote you from this. You said, pausing export development of liquefied natural gas without providing alternatives is akin to withholding drugs from an addict, knowing full well they can still buy them down the street.
Mm.
What do you think we need to do with liquefied natural gas?
Yeah, so I mean, what I was arguing in that article is you really need a global drop in demand for liquefied natural gas, because, and this goes back to the sort of the logic we were getting at with the sin taxes, because the demand is so inelastic, right? Because Europe right now, they need it for energy security, and they're going to get it from Qatar if they can't get it from Russia. What you really want is something like a carbon tax to, lower the demand for stuff like that, and a long-term strategy to build up clean industries to replace the need for liquefied natural gas. Because an export pause, it feels good, but it's a short-term solution, and it won't stop people from using the liquefied natural gas.
I would have thought the opposite is actually true, that liquefied natural gas is one of the best ways to produce energy from a clean standpoint, and that we should be promoting the export of liquefied natural gas and hoping that it's going to replace coal and other forms of hydrocarbons that are used. Why aren't we? And I come back to this. When was it? A couple of years ago, where the Germans came to Canada and asked for us to export liquefied natural gas. The Prime Minister said there wasn't a business case for a liquefied natural gas facility on the east coast of Canada. And then promptly the Australians and the Americans satisfied that German demand. And so clearly they got their act together and were able to put a business case together and supply. So I would have thought the opposite, that promoting liquefied natural gas is the right strategy.
So there's certainly a business case for liquefied natural gas. I think that's definitely true. And there's kind of a middle ground here. I wouldn't say that you know, LNG is bad or LNG is good, right? It has a role to play in the transition. Like you said, it's much cleaner than coal. It's much cleaner than a lot of fuels that we use. I think we also do need to be realistic about, the timeline we're looking at for, global warming and, how fast temperatures are rising. And I think there's some good research to say, well, liquefied natural gas is cleaner, but maybe it's not as clean, not as much cleaner to the extent that we thought before, right? Like we're only looking at maybe the production. We're not looking at the whole production process when we get those carbon emission numbers or, things like that. So yes, there is a part of the strategy, I think, that involves perhaps expanding LNG in the short run. But I think in the long run, like you still want to move away from LNG and towards cleaner fuels.
Towards what? What's the alternative? We're not going to be able to have enough solar farms and windmills, are we?
I don't think so. Not in time. I don't think the battery technology, the storage is there yet. This goes a little bit beyond my area of expertise, but I would say, there's been a movement in places like in Europe. I think certainly in Japan, where people are a bit skeptical of nuclear now. I'm personally a bit more warm to the idea. I think if you can have the right policies in place, if you're careful, you can sort of mitigate those risks of nuclear, and it's very clean and it's very effective. So I would be more sympathetic to that, but I'm sure
I agree with you. I think nuclear makes a lot of sense, and I think that a lot of people's attitudes have changed from this very negative environmental concern about nuclear waste to, oh my, doesn't have carbon, and so therefore it's actually a very good solution long term. And when you think about Ontario, the only way that Ontario got rid of coal is by way of nuclear production. So we've improved our atmosphere. And I think there's statistics in regards to smoggy days in the summer and sickness with children and things like this, that getting rid of coal and replacing it with nuclear was the reason why that has occurred. That said, I don't believe we're ever going to have nuclear that's going to be able to replace all the hydrocarbons. And from a geopolitical standpoint, I understand that while Saskatchewan and Alberta have a little bit of nuclear, a significant amount of nuclear, most of it comes from Kazakhstan and Russia. And so do we want to, become beholden to Kazakhstan and Russia in regards to the supply of uranium? I think liquefied natural gas is the cleanest of the hydrocarbons, is it not?
I believe it is, yeah. And that's the extent to which I agree with you on this. I think that it certainly has a role to play as a transition fuel. The question is, and I'm sympathetic to people who are worried about, we lock in a contract for too long and it becomes too late and we get an extra degree of temperature rises or something like that. So I kind of see it on both sides for this one, I think.
Fascinating. I enjoy reading your columns. We're going to take a break and we're going to come back and chat about another column that you wrote about housing affordability and the housing crisis, and how some people are blaming immigration. And you actually were arguing for more immigration, albeit immigration of people that could actually build homes. Stay with us, everyone. We're back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. The Canadian economy is the topic tonight. Our guest is Kevin Yin. He's an economist doing a PhD at Berkeley in California. He's a Canadian from Edmonton, and he's got a undergraduate degree from Canada, a graduate degree from Yale, and now he's at Berkeley. And he's also a regular columnist at the Globe and Mail, and I've enjoyed reading his columns on a regular basis. And so it's a real pleasure to have you join us. You wrote about immigrants and the housing crisis, and it was interesting because that you argue that immigration could actually be part of the solution when a lot of people were arguing that immigration is part of the problem. Tell us about that argument, please.
Yeah, I was mostly looking at these enormous construction labor shortages, right? I mean, you need people to build homes, and we don't have them. And so the argument there was kind of that, okay, I understand that, maybe we need to keep an eye on how many people we're bringing into the country, as, it has to keep pace with the homes that we're building, but we also need to bring enough people in to actually build those homes. And that was kind of the argument of that call.
What do you think we got to do to get out of our housing crisis right now?
Ooh, it's a really tough question. And, I'm sure there are lots of people who have thought very hard about this. I think, there's some good stuff moving in the right direction about addressing these sort of archaic zoning laws that, just make it hard to build homes in places because, oh, you can't build a residential thing here, you can't do this there. And I think there have been some good moves from the federal government to offer incentives to municipalities directly to sort of, reduce those barriers to building homes. I think you got to pour a lot more money into it. That's for sure. I'm pretty sympathetic to moving away from property as an investment and more as a good for people, because I think the investment, using property as an investment, even though it grows the economy, you see that it shows up in your GDP because house prices have grown. If you don't sell that house immediately, you haven't really produced more stuff, right? There isn't really more stuff in the economy. You just have a house that people want more. And I think that's a huge problem. That's a huge bottleneck for the housing issue. And then, the other thing was, what I argued in the column is that you really need to address this labor shortage. You probably need to expand some of these categories for temporary or long-term immigration that, allow companies to just go find people who can, meet their labor demands and build these homes. And I think that would be a good start, but I'm not sure that would be enough, to be honest. I think it's a huge problem, and we really need to. It's an all hands on deck kind of situation.
Are we putting all hands on deck? And let me actually, before I ask you that, you used an adjective to describe our regulations. What was it, that adjective?
Well, archaic with
archaic is what you said. Archaic. What does archaic mean?
Really old and out of date.
Really old and out of date. I couldn't agree with you more. I think our regulations and our red tape and our processes for approvals really, truly are archaic. And Kevin, I appreciate you using such a word. It's a great adjective. So are we all hands on deck? Because, we've got municipal governments that are frankly defending their archaic, as you call it, red tape and regulations, and blaming provincial governments on their lack of ability to streamline the process. So what do we got to do to, I've been told that it takes 3 times as long to get a house or a development approved as it does to actually build it. So it takes 3 times as long to push the paper around City Hall as it does to actually get all the people that you're worried about we don't have enough of to actually, lay the bricks and pour the concrete.
Yeah, I mean, that's a shocking statistic, and I wouldn't be surprised if that were true. I think, no, I don't think we're all hands on deck, and it's exactly like you said. There's a lot of sort of passing the buck, blaming other, aspects of government. It's really frustrating to see, provincial governments intervening. I believe this is the case for Alberta, where they were really frustrated that the federal government went straight to the municipalities and they said, we just want to address it with the people who are putting in these archaic zoning laws. Like, we want to incentivize them to get rid of them. We'll just bypass the provincial government. And I think the Albertans were pretty frustrated about that. But, I mean, this is a crisis situation, right? We need to move past, we need to move through the chain of command a bit more quickly to get these houses built. I mean, that's just the approval process, right? That's just getting the zoning laws taken down, to say nothing of getting the homes actually built. So yeah, I think there's a lot of unnecessary disagreement on this issue, given that we all agree that it's an issue.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think this really is one of those issues where we should have all hands on deck. And I think that when you've got something that is as archaic, and I love that adjective, as it is, we need some massive change. Let me change topics for a second, if I could. We've had a lot of comments about the lack of productivity in Canada, the lack of prosperity, the fact that our real disposable income hasn't gone up in something like 15 years. That 10 years ago, our productivity, prosperity was comparable to the United States, and now it's something like 30 or 40% below the United States on a real disposable income on a per capita basis. What do you think's wrong with Canada, and what do we need to do to change things?
I'm so glad you brought this up, because I think the productivity issue is just, I don't think it's talked about enough. People are worried about recessions and things all the time, but growth at the end of the day is what makes people wealthier, right? You could have a recession every year if your economy is growing really quickly, and still be better off at the end. In terms of how we address this, I mean, the first issue that I think a lot of people have touched on already is this investment drought. We just don't have enough investment per person in the economy right now. And I think, there are myriad reasons for that. But that has to be addressed. Canadians and foreigners need to feel like Canada is a great place to park their money and earn returns. I think part of doing that might involve a bit of government support for certain industries that other countries have now decided that they're going to support as well. I think cutting some red tape and allowing highly productive industries like tech to thrive in Canada would be a start. I mean, if you look at profit per worker in various companies in the US, the top ones are all energy and tech. And while Canada has some really strong energy companies, our tech industry, I think, is lagging a bit. If you talk to VCs, they're like, Canadian capital is a bit conservative. We're not sure if we can, we're not sure if people are willing to invest in these like sort of riskier ventures. I mean, we have to get over that. That's a big problem.
You're doing your PhD in the United States right now, so you're probably pretty familiar with what's going on in the United States. My understanding is that their deficit on a per capita basis is higher than Canada. Their debt to GDP is worse than Canada. We get a lot of criticism in Canada that our deficit's too high, that our debt's too high, and yet, the fiscal stimulus that the Biden administration has been executing seems to actually have fueled the economy far better in the United States, maybe building in a little bit more inflation, which obviously Biden is taking the negative impact from, but their unemployment level is lower, their productivity is higher, their prosperity is higher. They put a lot of money through the CHIPS Act into technology, as you mentioned. They're building infrastructure. So what's the right strategy? Is it this strategy of reduce the deficit and balance the budget? Or is it no, fiscal stimulus and grow the economy?
This is a tough one. I think it's definitely reasonable to look at how well the U.S. is doing right now and say maybe the Biden administration deserves some credit for that in pumping money into it. At the same time, productivity is sort of a deeper issue than just the ebbs and flows of GDP. And I don't think that short-term stimulus is going to show up in the productivity necessarily, right? Because the productivity ultimately comes down to how technologically advanced you are, how much research are you putting out, how much, how profitable, and how much, to some extent, how much of a monopoly on goods do you have globally, right? Are you producing things that no one else has on Earth? And certainly the US does that far better than Canada. So I wouldn't be an advocate of fiscal stimulus right now. I think a growth strategy needs to be a long-term strategy. Certainly, there are investments that the government needs to make, probably some incentives, some carrots and sticks that they need to be willing to spend some money on. But in terms of a large stimulus strategy, I don't think I would be an advocate for that.
Why? It's worked in the United States.
Um, but it's hard to say that it's worked. I mean, it's hard to just say, oh, they put money in and the output is, you know, a stronger economy. I think there's a lot of reasons that the U.S. economy
Okay,
is
so the
strong right
U.S.
now.
has got the strongest growth in the OECD. I understand. It's got the lowest unemployment. It's, the currency is doing extremely well again. What would be the cause of that if not the fiscal stimulus?
Well, I think they just have a lock on a lot of industries that the rest of the world doesn't. I mean, GDP is not just the number of goods you make, right? It's the price times the number of goods. And that price is going to be really high if no one else can make those kinds of goods. Now, you have a lot of companies in the US that make goods that no one else can make, right? So Canada doesn't have an Apple or a Microsoft or an OpenAI or anything, along these lines. And that, those kinds of things don't come from a stimulus package, right? They come from just a good innovation environment, which,
So
comes
you're
from a
you're 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 going to Berkeley. Some people would disagree with you and say the reason why Silicon Valley, Berkeley, California grew was because of military spending and defense spending and the spin-offs from the agglomeration that takes place in that area. And that if you didn't have the stimulus that came from military spending, you wouldn't have had all those companies you just mentioned. So was it just having a capitalist environment, or was it frankly industrial policy that was the fiscal stimulus to get all those companies going?
Yeah. So, okay, this is a good point. And I would differentiate here what I mean by, fiscal stimulus and, industrial policy. I think if you choose the right way to spend that money, right? So, yeah, there's a lot of talk about how, research investments and stuff can spill over into the private sector and be really beneficial. And I'm sympathetic to that. But, I think when people talk about fiscal stimulus, I mean, I'm in my head, I'm imagining like stimulus checks, like creating jobs that, your big infrastructure projects and stuff like this. These things put money in people's pockets. They're really good to deal with a recession. Those are not a growth strategy. They're a business cycle strategy, right? They mitigate recessions. That's something I'm not entirely an advocate for. And, the Biden spending package is not, something I've looked super deeply into. So I can't really speak to what extent is this like industrial policy? To what extent is this just like a fiscal stimulus? But I think that if we're talking about fiscal stimulus in the way that I'm thinking about it, I don't think that's a growth strategy.
I tend to agree with you again. I think that the money that Canada has spent has been primarily on part-time jobs and or public jobs. And you take a look at the employment statistics. The biggest growth engine for employment in Canada has been public sector employment, which I don't think is necessarily the most productive way to spend money and to grow our employment. The statistic I heard last week on one of my interviews was that there's more people working in the CRA, Canadian Revenue, today than in our military, which I think is a misplaced priority. And I think that what Biden has done with the Infrastructure Act, the CHIP Act, et cetera, the inflation policies that they've had have been primarily money's going to private industry to do things. And so I think it's probably a better source of or a better target for fiscal stimulus. Let me ask you a final question, if I could, before we take a final break. And that is that I went to a really interesting speech by Jeff Rubin, a former chief economist at CIBC, who's come out with a book about the Canadian economy. And he was talking about sort of where we are from an inflation standpoint. And he said, it's not a lot of these things that people were, arguing about. It wasn't interest rates. It wasn't supply issues. It was 100% the increase in the money supply. And that Chicago economists were right, that if you have this massive quantitative easing that we executed, that the central banks executed during the pandemic, and you dramatically increase the money supply, you're going to get inflation. Can you explain that to everybody?
Yeah. So this is like a really classic logic in macroeconomics, which is that if you put a bunch of money in people's hands, they want to buy more stuff. The supply hasn't changed, so the demand is going to drive those prices up. And that's, when the prices go up, then uh, because of labor unions, you're going to get wages going up, and you can get inflation spirals that way. But I will say I'm really not in favor of this view for thinking about the recent inflationary growth. I think it is largely a supply issue.
Fascinating. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments with our smart economist in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Our guest tonight is Kevin Yin. He is a regular columnist at the Globe and Mail. He's a PhD economics student at Berkeley. He's from Canada. He's a really smart guy. He has a knack of putting things in complicated issues into language that we can all understand. So, Kevin, what is the cause of inflation during the last couple of years?
I think it's primarily a supply chain issue. I think if you look at a bunch of developed countries, a lot of them have entirely different fiscal policies, entirely different monetary bases, right? Some countries had skyrocketing monetary bases, like people will point at Canada and the US. Some didn't. People will point at Germany. Inflation was like 6 to 7% across the board for all of those countries, right? So there's something in common that is causing the inflation. That isn't just, certainly the, spending is not helping the issue, but there's something in common that is causing the bulk of this issue. I think it's, kind of a simple explanation to say, yeah, it's hard to get stuff. So the supply is constrained. So the prices have gone up.
So, when Pierre Poilievre in Canada says it's just inflation, blaming it on Justin Trudeau, or when Donald Trump last Thursday blamed it all on Biden as the cause for inflation, are they wrong?
I would say they're wrong. Yeah. It makes for good politics, certainly, if you can tag someone's name onto the end of inflation. It's very catchy. And, our leaders want to take credit for the economy in good times, whether that credit is warranted or not. So I guess they have to take a bit of credit in bad times too. But I think it's actually not fair to say that this inflation is their fault. Now, we can criticize how it's been dealt with. You can criticize, some people might say you're adding fuel to the fire when you spend that much. But personally, I think it's largely a supply chain issue. It had to be addressed, at the company level, at the supply chain level, maybe with some monetary with some monetary policy. But
so I don't understand. I apologize. If it's a supply chain issue because of the pandemic, why would higher interest rates have solved the problem? Why should we just not have opened up our trade routes again?
Yeah, I think initially it wouldn't have solved the problem, and that's something I was arguing in my very first piece for the Globe. But the thing is, the nature of inflation, the number can remain the same, but the underlying cause can change as it moves on. So as the supply chain issue gets addressed, a large determinant in how inflation moves forward is what people think inflation is going to be in the future, right? Because they're going to set prices based on that. Companies are going to set prices based on that. People are going to bargain for wages harder or less, depending on how much they think inflation is going up. And so as the supply chain issue gets addressed, these become the dominant forces pushing inflation forward. And so the interest rates address that part of the issue, right? They can't fix the supply chains, but they can sort of dampen people's the market and firms and consumers' expectations about inflation.
Kevin, if you're right that supply chain issues have been the cause of the inflation that we've encountered over the course of the last couple of years, and we're in a situation with geopolitics right now that we're no longer, bringing stuff in from Russia to Canada and the United States and or to Europe, and we're restricting how much we bring in from China. And frankly, you know, we hear things about friendshoring and bringing manufacturing jobs back to Canada and the United States. And frankly, Trump now talking about a 10% tariff on all of Chinese goods. Aren't we going to create even more inflation in the future and just create a situation where there is less globalization, less global trade, less, you know, bringing in cheap products from wherever else around the world? And so by definition, are we not going to have a more expensive inflationary environment going forward?
Well, I don't think so. And I think the important thing here is that the inflation comes from like a sharp, break in the supply chain, right? Where suddenly people still want the same amount of stuff, but you can't get it at all. If that adjustment period is slow, then people's the prices don't skyrocket, and then people don't freak out about it. They don't drive up prices really quickly. Things are kind of okay. And I actually think that the friendshoring might be helpful to hedge against future inflationary episodes, because you can get these kinds of sharp supply chain shocks when you have a geopolitical crisis, right? And so the friendshoring basically says, well, even in the case of a crisis like that, suppose there's a war, or we're just not getting along anymore, we can still source our goods at the same price that we did before. And so I actually think it helps hedge against these kinds of inflationary risks in the future.
Kevin, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
What a fascinating conversation about the economy. I look forward to reading your next column in the Globe and Mail.
Thanks so much.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from California, Berkeley, at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody. Thanks, Kevin.